But now I'm going to talk to you about some techniques for qualitative research analysis. This is a short guide, and the overall message of this, once again, is that there is no absolute right or wrong way, but there are some tips that I can give you to help make the research process a bit more ordered, because it can be very overwhelming, I think, when you finish a project and you have a huge amount of data to get through. So what is the point of qualitative research? Well, it makes sense of messiness. And on the right hand of the screen, you can see the quote, it puts an organising framework on the messiness of real life. So what you're doing through analysing qualitative data is finding patterns, finding meaning in the very rich detail of everyday life. Qualitative research can give us very sharp insights into how people live, what motivates their choices, and how their behaviours might be influenced differently. So really, you're just giving meaning to the very rich detail of what people already do. Context is very important for analysis, both the context in which the research takes place, but also your own context. So you need to think when you're doing the analysis that you have some personal involvement, you have some research bias, just because of your own context as a researcher. So the kind of life that you live, the kind of relationship that you have to the respondents who you're talking to, and the subject as well. But you also need to bear in mind the context of the research, so where it was held, maybe what time of year, whether something in the wider news or media might have affected the kind of answers that you were getting. Take all of this into consideration because it's all important for your analysis. So it would be, I guess, too high an expectation to imagine that you could get very pure data from qualitative research, but that's part of the very rich and exciting thing about it. So it's not used for the same purpose as quantitative research. Here again, subjectivity and reflexivity. Here are the kind of technical words that you might use to recognize your own position in relation to the subject. So reflect, maybe even before the research begins, what biases you might hold. And it's a very useful discussion to have with the other people on your project team, just to make yourselves aware of whether you have any preconceptions or hypotheses or biases which might impact the way that you are reading the data. There is no one way to analyse qualitative data, and a lot of qualitative analysis is down to the researcher's instinct, the way that their brain works, the type of project that they are on. And there's a huge amount of, there's very different ways. Some people like to work in spider diagrams. Some people are very visual and will draw things. Some people will write everything down. So there's no one way. But ultimately, you as a very smart researcher can use your instincts to extract what seems important and interesting, and interpret how that has significance for your project. Again, there's no one way to go through data analysis, but what I'm trying to convey with this chart is that analysis and data collection occur simultaneously. So your discussion with your project team about what you're observing, what it might mean, can happen right from when you're doing the interviews itself, right the way through to when you're coding the data and writing the final outcome. Here we go, through each stage, downloading your first thoughts. So this might only take 10 minutes after you have conducted an interview, but it's a really useful way to write down your first impressions while they're fresh in your mind. Any standout ideas, words, themes which you have noticed which feel significant and which you might want to come back to and think about in more detail later. Go back to the interview guide and pull out the key details from each section or topic that you have spoken about. And what you might want to do before conducting your fieldwork is to agree with your teammates how you want to download this data, download these first thoughts rather, because it's a very quick and easy way to share information as you're going through, you might have 36 interviews or something like that, and it's a very quick way to make sure that everybody is up to date with the kind of findings that are coming out. Reviewing your transcript notes. You might not always be lucky enough to have transcript notes, but where you do, it can be very useful to go through with a fine comb, as we say, so that you can pick out the words, the phrases that people use, and the little ideas that you might have missed when you were just writing down your first thoughts. It's also a really great way to refamiliarize yourself with an interview. So if it was something that you did 2 weeks ago, you can really put yourself back in that context and remember all of the interesting details that came out. And things to look out for in this stage will be words and phrases that people use quite often, the stories that people tell and the way that they express themselves, and things that you didn't expect to hear as well. If there are any surprises, this might be an interesting time to note those down. A note on analysing projective techniques, and I have included this because if you are running exercises like using collage or using personification, you really need to dig down into what is sitting behind the ideas that people come up with. It's not useful to you to to write down that they chose some pictures of leaves or of clouds. It doesn't mean anything. So it's really important when you're analysing the projective exercises that people did to start digging down quite early on. What does it mean? What ideas is it laddering up to? Does it have any symbolic or cultural meaning or context? Coding your data. There's a huge amount that has been written academically about this and that you could read up on. But the idea here is that you start to ladder up from the raw data that you have witnessed and noted down to some key themes and overall terms which start to group your data in relevant and interesting ways. And so there's various data software that you could use to make this easier, but equally you could do this through discussion by sitting down in a room with the other people who are working on the project and finding the themes and the patterns that are starting to emerge. And you can derive these codes from theories or from relevant research findings or from your own research objectives. There's no right way to start attaching codes to the data that you've come up with, but it might be useful to you to attach them to some theory, for instance. A common pitfall is to use the main interview questions as codes, and that would be that not all of the specific questions and the words that you asked in the interview can be coded. And really, what you might end up, if you were to do that, would be a summary of what was said rather than an analysis that went a bit deeper. And so it's very useful to discuss and debate the codes and the meanings that you are gaining from going through the data with other people, because as we were just talking about, because everyone's different positionality and perspective, you may read a conversation in a different way. So it's very useful to discuss and debate with other people here. Structuring your primary analysis. Now, this is the kind of advice that I've often been given. Unfortunately, there's not always time to put everything into a nice, neat table, but it can be very useful for you to have in mind where you do have time, or it's a nice idea to think about what kind of information you're extracting. So here on the left-hand side, we've got the topics that you might have gone through in your discussion guide. Then you've got the data, the quotes and the conversations that came out relating to each topic. And then, as you can see from the bits that I've underlined, you can start to pull out different codes. And that's a kind of a word or phrase that summarises an idea that is recurrent in the data that's coming out. So you want to ideally move beyond just describing what's being said to interpreting and explaining it in your analysis. And from data codes to thematic structures. Again, I think this will come naturally as part of the analysis process, but this is where you start to ladder up the little ideas, the key themes that you have picked out, that you identify, and building them into wider ideas, thematic structures. And you might find as you go through that not all of the codes are still relevant or interesting to the wider structures and the wider story that you want to tell about the project. So this is really quite a creative process of working up from the raw data to finding the themes and patterns, and then building this into the larger story that you want to tell. So a very quick checklist for analysis, and you can use this checklist as questions to ask yourself at every point during the fieldwork and after the fieldwork when you start to go through the analysis more rigorously. So what patterns and common themes emerge around specific ideas? Are there any deviations from these patterns? What stories are emerging from the data? And do any of the patterns suggest that additional data needs to be collected? And finally, do the patterns that emerge support the findings of other corresponding qualitative analyses that have been conducted? So these are questions to have in mind at the back of your mind, thinking about what your expectations were, what your hypotheses were going into this data, and what are the surprises and the new pieces of information that have come out from collecting all of this fresh data. So they're just good things to have in mind. And that is the end of the webinar, but I hope that you've enjoyed it and that it's been useful. And you can always email me for more information or if you have any questions. Thanks.